In today's lessons, the widow in the Old Testament I'll call widow number 1, and the widow in the New Testament I'll call widow number 2. And as I prepared for today, I wondered if widow number 2 was aware of widow number 1 and had perhaps even been inspired by widow number 1 when it came to trusting God. Of course, it's entirely possible because widow number 1 is part of the saga of the great prophet Elijah, and that would have been well known. That story would have been well known to the people of Jesus' day. So let's start by reminding ourselves about widow number 1, and I'll try to make the story as condensed and thrilling as possible. Okay, gotta get the characters of the story right. And the characters of the story are King Ahab, who was the king of Israel, and his evil and idolatrous wife named Jezebel. And Jezebel and Ahab were at odds with God's prophet Elijah. The reason being that Jezebel and her family were worshippers of the god Baal. And Ahab was allowing himself to be swayed in that direction, so that he had allowed an idol to be put up in the capital city of Samaria. Okay, so that's the background. So, Elijah is sent by God to Ahab to say, you know, you're really on the wrong track. You're leading the people of Israel on the wrong track. You're destroying our religion and our culture and our people. And you're not listening. So, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a drought. The rain is going to cease. And we can imagine that Ahab and Jezebel went, yeah. But Elijah, after speaking those words, goes into hiding. Because he knows that once it stops raining and the crops fail and the people are hungry, he's going to be a wanted man. And so he is. But remember, Elijah also is impacted by the drought. And at some point, the food and the water that is being supplied to him runs out. And it is at that point that Elijah faces a crisis of trust. Even though he's been communicating with God, even though he has been the representative of God, Elijah now is at a point where his life is at risk. And the question is he going to trust God or not? It's a crisis of trust. So God tells him to go to the village of Zarephath. And so I imagine Elijah walking along this, cliff, this crisis of trust, because this is the part that isn't clear in the text when you read it. Zarephath is in Gentile territory, and it's only a day's journey from the home of who? It starts with a J. Jezebel, his arch enemy. So you can imagine that as Elijah, who's now hungry, his food and water's run out, as he heads for Zarephath, which is just a day's journey from his enemy, he's scared to death. And he's thinking, where is this widow going to show up who's supposed to feed me? Well, he gets to the outskirts of the city and he encounters who? A widow. And he doesn't really ask her to give him food and water. He tells her to give him food and water. And she balks because she has just a little tiny bit of food. She wants to prepare it for herself and her son, and then she assumes that's it for them. They're going to die. There's nothing else left. And so Elijah tells her, I think he has the audacity to tell her, don't be afraid. One of the commentators I read, I like the way that she describes it. She says, you can imagine this widow thinking, yeah, right. Don't be afraid. Uh-huh. Who are you to tell me not to be afraid? You haven't gotten to the point where you're about, of course she doesn't really know what's going on with him, you haven't gotten to the point where you're about to eat your last meal. You haven't watched your food supply dwindle down to nothing. You haven't seen your only child get thinner and thinner and more listless. How can you ask me to use my last morsel of food to feed you? There just isn't enough. She is facing a what? Crisis of trust. And the interesting thing is, I think, that they both are in the midst of this crisis of trust. Are they going to trust God? And they both do. Maybe because they don't have any other choice. She trusts God by responding to him. He trusts God by asking her and going to Zarephath. And in the end, we read that the oil didn't run out, the jar of meal was never empty, and every day there was enough to make food for them. And so every day they had to trust God. And every day, presumably, as they trusted God, their faith grew. And so we come to the gospel lesson. And there's that widow. She's standing in the temple. She's standing in front of the treasury. And she has in her hand 2 of these tiny little coins, just like this, that we passed around for you all to see. We've come to call them the widow's mite. They're worth, we are told in the text, a penny. But the important point of the story is that they are all she has. It says that they are all she has to live on. Just these 2 little pennies. People all around her are putting in large amounts into the treasury. And this is what she's holding in her hand, these 2 little pennies. And I wonder if as she held them there, she thought about the widow who had just this little bit of food and yet acted. She could have, the widow in the first story, could have said, I'm not doing it. Go find somebody else to feed you. Maybe this widow thought of her and thought, I'm going to trust. And she put them both in the treasury. And Jesus says that her gift is greater than the gift of all the other people. Why? Because she gave all she had. Because she trusted God. I think maybe if I was standing there holding these 2 coins in my hand, I might give one and keep the other. Just, as an illusion of self-sufficiency. Isn't that the way we function? So, we have 2 stories today where people face a crisis of trust. And I'm guessing that most of us here have also faced a crisis of trust, to greater or lesser degrees in our lives. There's a pastor whose sermon I was reading this week, and I thought this illustration that he gave was one with which most of us can identify. His name is Dr. Hayner, and he gives this personal example. My father has recently died at the age of 93. For the last 10 years, he had been the sole caregiver of my mother, who had Alzheimer's disease. He prayed that he would outlive my mother. But as cancer began to claim his body, he had to face a new crisis of trust. Could he trust God with my mother's safekeeping? Could he trust us that God knew best. Most of us would like to be in control. But in the end, control is just an illusion. Every day, we must learn to trust. Every day, we must learn to trust. And I would say that for myself and for a lot of people I know, more often than not, the way we learn to trust is we get right to the edge. Just like Elijah and the two widows, where there's nothing else we can do. And then, hopefully, we trust. Now, we don't have to do it that way, but that's the way we tend to do it. And this can happen for us as individuals, and it can happen to us as a congregation or a group of Christians. For example, most of you know that I'm on the board of Trinity Seminary. When everybody here is working hard on the rummage sale the last few years, I've been in Columbus at the board meeting. So your feet are hurting and my brain is hurting simultaneously. The board meeting is always the first weekend of November. So I was there last weekend, and as is true of most mainline denominations, the seminary is facing both financial, well, I guess primarily financial difficulties due to lack of enrollment and financial support. And all the things that can be done to address that have pretty much been done. And so now is the point at which some really out-of-the-box stuff has to be tried. So this is the context of the meeting, and I'm sitting there, and I'm sitting next to a gentleman who's a vice president of a university in the area, and he leans over to me and he says, well, do you think we have the guts to do, meaning the board, do you think we have the guts to do what needs to be done? That means doing some of this out-of-the-box stuff. And I leaned back and looked at him and I said, well, we will when we have to. We get right to the edge. Which reminds me, I went to a synod-sponsored meeting. And I was sitting at a table with a bunch of Lutherans, and amazingly, I mean, it was a miracle, among this bunch of Lutherans was a young man who was in his early 20s. And we were talking about what our hope was for our congregations. He was a member of a congregation in the area. And he said that he wished that he had some sort of worship service or some sort of program that his congregation did that he could invite his girlfriend and his friends to, and they would come. They wouldn't be intimidated by it. And I said, well, what would that look like? So he starts describing this thing that is, I mean, it's nothing like anything we're doing here at Faith Lutheran Church, even at our contemporary service. It's I don't know if there's any mainline denomination churches that are doing it. But he's describing this gathering, but he's thinking of it at the church because he goes to church. So he's, you know, it's just out of the box. It's all this interactive electronic stuff where, you know, you tweet the pastor during the sermon and, you know, music that's different than the baby boomer music. And, you know, just really, I couldn't hardly get my head around what he was talking about. So I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about what that means and what that would look like and about how this young man really wanted something like that because he knew that it was important to him, but his friends wouldn't come with it when he invited them. And then I read this article in the Lutheran. It was in this month's edition of the Lutheran. And in this story, this church in Ohio, so it's not like it's in New York City, this church in Ohio decided to do what this young man was describing. They wanted to create at their church this kind of service where younger, people under 30, mostly people in their early to mid-20s, could come, and it was a relaxed environment, and they could interact with each other about transitions and decisions and questions of faith, and the music was what fit their situation, and a lot of electronics, and they tried and tried to do this. They picked an evening, they did an evening, not on Sunday morning. For a year they tried. And guess what? Didn't work. I mean, they thought they were on the right track. They thought they had done good planning, they had gotten all the right information, and a year later they just had to, after a year of trying, they had to give it up. And they were really discouraged. I mean, this is a crisis of trust. This is what we thought you wanted us to do, God. We tried it, it didn't work. What is it that we are supposed to do? And so at one of these final sort of wrap-up meetings, they gathered where they always gathered to plan their worship services. And they looked around and they thought, this place has the environment that we want. And the people are here. There's all these young professionals and graduate students, and everyone's talking about interacting with each other about their lives and the issues that are important to them. You want to guess where it was? Huh?
Like a Panera.
It was, well, close. It was a bar and grill. It was a bar and grill. And so they thought, the only thing that's not here, the environment's here, the electronics are here, the people are here. The only thing that's not here is the church. So I don't know if it was that particular place, but they found a place like that. They passed out cards with the information. The first time they met, they had 12 people. And now, he didn't say, I don't think, how long this has been going on, but now they have 50 people. Now, if you're thinking, oh, let's do that. And then all those young people will come to our church. You kind of missed the point. Because the point is that for many, probably most of those people, that event, which they call pub theology, that event is church for them. Because those are people who probably wouldn't find their way to a church. Now, will they ever find their way to a traditional church? I don't know. But for now, that is their church. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Throughout our lives, as a congregation and as individuals, we have these times when we have a crisis of trust. And we're just right up on the edge of it, usually. And we're about to fall over when we, hopefully, throw up our hands and say, I'm just going to trust God. The alternative, of course, is to fall into the abyss of our own self-reliance, which is usually lacking. And here's the interesting thing that often happens. When we do throw up our hands and say, I'm just going to trust God, God shows up. Usually in ways that we don't expect. I mean, those people at that church in Ohio that I just described never had the idea of pub theology in their minds. But God shows up in interesting ways. And so, every day, we have the opportunity. Our life just gives us these opportunities to learn to trust God. Wouldn't it be great if we could learn to do it sooner rather than later? Amen. In other words, don't get right to the edge.